Did you know that at one point in Islamic history there were over 100 legitimate legal schools? Today, most Muslims are familiar with the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i and Hanbali schools, but in earlier centuries there were several. These included the Zahiri, Awza'i, Thawri, Laythi, Jariri and Ibadi schools, among many others, each with its own rigorous methodology and scholarly tradition. Early Islamic law was highly discursive, a defining feature that set it apart from other religious traditions of the time. While Judaism had legal traditions like the Pharisaic and Rabbinic schools, and Christianity featured theological diversity, neither matched the scale, openness, and institutionalized pluralism that characterized classical Muslim legal thought. The Islamic tradition not only allowed, but actively encouraged ikhtilaf, differences of opinion, within the framework of revelation. This wasn't left to informal debate, it was formalized through the development of madahib, legal schools, each with its own methodology for interpreting the Quran and Sunnah. These schools coexisted side by side, often recognized simultaneously by the state, something virtually unheard of in Christian and Jewish traditions at the time. This unique approach fostered an environment where no single group or school could claim exclusive ownership of the divine law, the Sharia. Instead, mutual respect among scholars created a legal culture where disagreement was not just tolerated but embraced as a mercy from God, reflecting both the complexity of human experience and the vastness of divine wisdom. But this entire tradition of inclusive legal thought began to collapse with the rise of Salafi Wahhabism, more commonly known today as Salafism. Unlike the classical Islamic approach, which respected differing interpretations, Salafism dismissed centuries of scholarship, rejected the established schools, and condemned long-standing practices as so-called innovations. It claimed a monopoly over the truth and branded anyone who disagreed as deviant. But this shift didn't just erase legal pluralism, it led to two deep psychological consequences crippling communities today: moral detachment and the social death of Muslims. To understand how this happened, we need to look beyond theology and examine the political realities that took shape in the modern era. After independence, many Muslim societies inherited the colonial systems that had once been used to dominate them. These systems were authoritarian, built to suppress dissent, not empower people. Leaders like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and the Assad regime in Syria didn't just adopt these tools of repression, they became dependent on them. These systems guaranteed control, silenced opposition, and crushed any attempt by ordinary people to reclaim agency, speak the truth, or demand a better future. Living under these regimes, Muslims often found themselves trapped in a constant state of tension between the ethical demands of their faith and the harsh realities of authoritarian rule. Speaking the truth or calling for justice could cost them everything. And so many chose silence. They learned, often for survival, when to look away. Over time, this wasn't just an individual coping mechanism, it became a societal norm. The psychologist Albert Bandura described this phenomenon as moral disengagement, a psychological process in which people, faced with persistent injustice and powerlessness, begin to unconsciously detach their moral compass from the world around them. What began as a strategy to endure injustice slowly eroded the will to confront it. But this mindset didn't stay limited to politics or personal psychology, it seeped into theology itself. What began as a coping mechanism for survival gradually reshaped the very way many Muslims came to understand their faith. Into this vacuum emerged Salafism. It didn't just align with the psychology of moral disengagement, it actively reinforced it, slowly eroding the social and moral fabric of Muslim societies, often without them even realizing it. In the classical Islamic tradition, Muslims were not only encouraged but obligated to seek knowledge and to use their intellect to discern truth from falsehood. Rational judgment was seen as a mark of spiritual maturity. As the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "The nobility of a man is in his religion, his manhood is in his intellect, and his honor is in his character." This ethic was crucial because Muslims were able to recognize and respect jurists not for rote memorization, but for their ability to diagnose society and issue rulings that advanced justice, mercy, and moral clarity. Scholars were expected to embody both legal insight and moral integrity, grounding their decisions in the Quran, Sunnah, and the lived realities of the people. Muslims understood intuitively that if the law produced cruelty or oppression, the fault lay not with revelation, but with the jurist. God could never be the source of injustice, so injustice signaled human failure, not divine error. But Salafism shifted this entirely. It taught Muslims that moral discernment was no longer necessary. There was no need to think, only to obey. Whether the outcome was just or unjust became irrelevant, because the goal was blind adherence to the law, not reflection or questioning. And to shield themselves from critique, Salafis claimed this wasn't their interpretation. It was simply what God commanded, leaving no room for error or discussion. This was unprecedented in Islamic history. The mindset didn't just discourage thinking, it replaced conscience with compliance, and the result has been devastating. One of the clearest real-world examples of this unfolded, ironically, in the holiest city of the Muslim world, Mecca, in 2002. When a fire broke out at a girls' school and students rushed to escape, something almost unimaginable occurred. They were blocked by members of the religious police because they weren't properly covered. According to Human Rights Watch, the Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice barred male rescuers from entering and physically stopped girls from fleeing, fearing violations of gender segregation. Eyewitnesses and Saudi media reported that officers were more concerned with modesty than saving lives. 15 schoolgirls tragically died. Dozens were injured. No one was held accountable. The religious police defended their actions as upholding Islamic values, and across the Muslim world there was no outrage, only silence. A silence that revealed just how deeply moral disengagement had taken hold. This was Salafism taken to its logical conclusion, and it's not surprising because Salafism didn't just institutionalize moral disengagement, it perfected it. It trained Muslims to obey without question, convincing them that following legal rulings, no matter the outcome, was the only measure of righteousness. These rulings weren't seen as human efforts to understand the divine, they were treated as the voice of God himself, assisting Muslims to disengage with the consequences. This mindset stripped away the need for conscience. It made it easy to look the other way or even justify harm, when the target was a Shia, a Sufi, an Ash'ari, or anyone deemed deviant. By dividing the world into us, the saved, and them, the misguided, Salafism didn't just exclude other Muslims, it successfully dehumanized them. And when moral disengagement meets dehumanization, persecution becomes not just possible, but inevitable. But the damage doesn't stop within the Muslim world. What makes this even more dangerous is that Salafism has become rocket fuel for Islamophobia. It projects a version of Islam that is intolerant and hostile to diversity, perfectly aligning with the narratives used to justify fear and discrimination against Muslims. Yet instead of recognizing this threat, many scholars and institutions across the Muslim world show little concern. Ironically, they believe unity can be achieved through an ideology rooted in theological supremacy. By failing to confront this divisive framework, they and their followers unwittingly fuel Islamophobia against their own communities. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline and wondering why the flames keep getting bigger. But this raises a pressing question. Where are the Muslim scholars and thinkers who speak to any of this? What's most troubling is that Muslims themselves have often systematically sidelined their intellectual class, a consequence of deep-rooted anti-intellectualism in contemporary religious discourse. Those equipped to think critically and engage with complex ideological challenges are not merely overlooked, they are excluded, unsupported, and dismissed. This stands in stark contrast to the classical Islamic tradition. Scholars like Imam al-Ghazali were not just spiritual authorities, they were intellectual powerhouses who mastered the very ideologies they sought to critique. Al-Ghazali didn't simply condemn philosophy or the Batini sects from a distance, he studied their systems deeply, understood their internal logic, and then dismantled them with precision and insight. His effectiveness came from the fact that he seriously engaged the world as it was, not as he wished it to be. But when modern Muslim intellectuals attempt to do the same, they are often dismissed or ignored. Take Dr. Shabir Akhtar, for example. He held a PhD in philosophy from the University of Cambridge and was a rare figure who could speak fluently across Islamic and Western philosophical traditions. He was deeply grounded in the Quran, while also engaging thinkers like Kant, Hume, and Aquinas. His work tackled the moral challenges of modernity, the failures of secular liberalism, and the theological shortcomings of both Western and Muslim discourses. He wrote with clarity, depth, and conviction, offering exactly the kind of intellectual leadership Muslims claim to want. And yet, surprisingly again, he was largely abandoned by the Muslim world. He wasn't invited to institutions. He wasn't given a pulpit. His passing in 2023 went almost unnoticed by the very communities that would have benefited most from his thought, not because his work lacked merit, but because Muslims have cultivated a culture that no longer recognizes it. And so the void remains. The thinkers most capable of reconnecting Muslims with a tradition that values both intellect and moral conscience are conspicuously absent from the public square. In their place, the discourse is dominated by shallow soundbites, unchallenged dogma, and a theology increasingly detached from the ethical vision and moral ambition of the Quran. Until Muslims are willing to rehabilitate their intellectual tradition, not just in theory but through concrete institutional and cultural reform, they will remain vulnerable to moral disengagement, to social death, and to the slow erosion of their ability to even recognize when something has gone catastrophically wrong. The genocide in Gaza today is not a shocking anomaly. It is the direct outcome of decades of internal decay, silence, and the widespread normalization of dehumanization. Please like, share, and follow so more people can understand the psychological ailments that are crippling Muslim societies.